My presentation today, it's called The Futures for Liberating Learners and Technology. And I really wanted to thank TESS, eCampus Ontario, just for having the space, getting you all here back together. It's amazing that this is happening. So thank you for inviting me and being a part of this with you. It's great to meet you. You're gonna have my email available at the end of the presentation, or at some point when you get the slides, it will be there. And I'm always happy to hear from people that I don't know anything about. I just got some emails today and they're great. It's always great to make connections with our work. As Terry was saying, I am the Director of Strategic Foresight Projects at KnowledgeWorks. And KnowledgeWorks is a nonprofit in the US. And we've looked into the future of learning since 2005. And ever since then, that kind of pulled KnowledgeWorks into the national stage. So we have developed a pretty stable cycle of publications in which every 3 years, we publish a forecast where we looked into the possibilities for the future of education in about like a 10-year time frame. So the second to last forecast was published in 2018, and it was called Navigating the Future of Learning. And from that one, we had some insights, and it's always so refreshing to kind of go into these deep process of research. But of course, then 2020 came and everything changed, right? So as we were thinking about what was going to be our next forecast, we started to look around, you know, get more familiar with what was happening, the level of uncertainty that we were all experiencing, and how it just seemed so hard to look into the future. It just seemed like there was so much up in the air that it was hard to really like take a look into the future. But we also noticed another interesting effect going on. We started to noticing that the future was everywhere. It was in all the headlines. It was in all the brands talking about, like, in their advertising, what's coming, what's not coming, all those listicles that you see around on the website talking to you about the future, how great it's gonna be, how miserable it's gonna be, just like everywhere, right? And you start to wonder about all these ideas of the future that you're getting. And so our team of futures at KnowledgeWorks really start to think about, wait a minute, whose future are we talking about here? When we talk about the future of learning, whose future have we been talking about all these years? And then it kind of hit us, right? We are a group of researchers, futurists in a room, and we were talking to the field about what's coming, but whose future are we putting forward and why? So we took a very long and deep view to how we do our own research. That was kind of like the place that we were familiar with, and which we could start with something different. So we were used to working in our small team to create these publications. And for the latest forecast, we decided to open up our process altogether. Just like, if we could rethink the whole process, what would we do differently to be more intentional about whose future we're talking about here? So we started by including some of our own colleagues at KnowledgeWorks. And we had a team of 7 internal advisors that were just great at giving us more inputs in terms of the social sciences, or maybe a lens through equity that we were not considering, or people that were working directly in the field with educators and students so they can kind of ground our abstract perspective. That's sometimes a little too out there for some, which is understandable. If we're not doing that, we're not doing it right. So that was great. That was a good, first step. We had 7 colleagues from our organization helping us throughout, from the framing to the very last draft of the research process. But it still felt like it was not enough. It was still people that we would work with, that were familiar with what we do. So we decided to invite 3 amazing women from the field with a lot of experience: Leah Austin, Temple Lovelace, and Shelley Sion, from different areas of education. And they were our external advisors. Again, working from us from the framing till the very end. And they were always pushing us. They were our thought partners, but also our worst nightmares, because they would come and just like destroy all our assumptions. All what we were thinking was true, for them it was not, right? And that was exactly what we wanted from them. So it was great. We had then 3 of them. However, still felt like it was not quite enough. Who else can we bring into this process? And we got 12 scenario collaborators that we brought along our process. We opened up our black box of research to them and created a participatory process for these 12 individuals to come along and do foresight with us, do futures research with us. And it just created the most amazing conversations. We had a student who was a high school senior at the time, and she was fabulous in this participation that we had. We had people from across the country, people from universities, people from independent schools, classroom teachers, principals, other nonprofit folks, races, multi-generational. We tried to cover a good ground with these 12 individuals, but it was still not enough, right? So we also invited 30 more people to provide inputs and be interviewees for us. So all this coming from just having 5 people in the room working together to bringing 50 more people to work on this project, our flagship project that has been very critical to the success of KnowledgeWorks in this 22 years that they've been around. And all that also, what you would expect, right? Yay, slides. No? Okay. I can see them here, so it's like, oh, they're happening. Okay. Sorry to, play with your dreams. In any case, so working with all these people, right? What it then infused us with like new insights, new learnings, new perspectives. And we started to think, okay, now we need to narrow this down a little bit. Let's have a focal question that's going to guide us through this whole process. So our question was, to what extent could public education be unconstrained by systems and structures of oppression in 20 years? First thing there, right? We change our time frame, our usual time frame, from 10 years to 20 years. Because from the feedback that we got from our contributors, they were like, this takes work and time. So you're not gonna see much change in 10 years. We need to go further. We said, okay, that's valid. That's a valid point. So let's stretch it. Let's think about 20 years. Now, what about this whole part about systems and structures that are anti-oppressive? What do we do with that? And as we started to dig deeper and have all these conversations and interviews, we landed on a concept that resonated. And it was liberatory education. And that, yay, it got it right. Because it is like a relative unused or undervalued concept. And in this process, we actually make a call to go beyond equity and reach for liberation. Because what we understand by liberation feels more meaningful, and it would be applied to a more systemic level, which would make a true transformative difference for educators and learners. So we drew from the two definitions, two different definitions for liberatory education. One from activist and political strategist Raphael Randall, and another one from educator Sarita Hammond. So Raphael talks about self-determination and people's right, particularly youth rights, to shape their own reality, participate fully in civil society, and just have that opportunity to engage more fully as individuals in society and the world. Sarita Hammond has a different approach based on evidence-based, culturally responsive learning opportunities that are based in neuroscience. So that's where we thought that combining these two perspectives of liberatory education was exactly what we needed. And by doing so, we then had enough of a foundation to create Imagining Liberatory Education Futures, which is our latest forecast that was released earlier this year in March. So, thank you. And from that one, what we did there is that we work with two critical uncertainties that our contributors help us identify. One was social cohesion, kind of, if you would understand, like as our ability to connect and create belonging across differences. So that was one. And what I mean with critical uncertainties are things that could either go kind of either way. So right now, a lot of things feel very polarizing, right? So that's where that social cohesion would come in. Like we could either be kind of closer together and understand each other, or we could be even more apart and isolated. So it could go kind of either way in this 10-year time frame. Now, the second critical uncertainty is the responsiveness of public institutions, which we also saw that could go either way. Institutions might see this critical opportunity, well, not critical opportunity, but more of a generational, historical moment that we all lived and like work together and, you know, kind of reflect on what happened, try to align their resources to satisfy the needs of their constituents and share power, or they could learn nothing and just keep doing things as they have been, right? So that's what we mean about critical uncertainty. Now, what we do with these two critical uncertainties is that we cross them to create a 2x2 matrix, and you get those 4 quadrants. So with these 4 quadrants, you get 4 stories, 4 different stories about the future. One of the things that we do as futurists is that we don't think about a future or like what this one thing that's going to happen. We talk about alternative futures, possibilities. So because we believe that today we have the agency to shape those futures, to shape what might happen. And to do that, to be better prepared for what might happen, you need to have a wider perspective. And that's why instead of creating one story of the future, we create 4 stories of the future. considering these two extremes where it could go. So social cohesion and public institutions responsiveness was qualified as high or low. So you would have then a scenario that it's high, high, a scenario that it's low, low, a high, low, and a low, high. I'm sure this would all make so much sense, right? With the 2x2. It's fine. Just like picture it in your mind. And of course, you can take a look later when you get the slides, or if you even go into our website, the forecast is available for free. Then it has been that way for ages. You can just go to knowledgeworks.org/forecast and you'll get there. I even had a QR code in my slides. It's so sad. It's okay. We'll get there. Okay, back to the presentation. So you get this 2x2, these 4 stories. And some of these stories, they seem that they're like good or bad, right? When you read them or when you start like learning about them. Because if you think about it, like, wait a minute, if we're talking about like a low social cohesion and low public institution responsiveness, doesn't that sound like a totally terrible scenario? Yes, right? Yeah. But these stories are not created to be inherently good or bad, because it just depends, right? Whose future? What's the perspective? Like, who is participating in the scenario? And then from difficult times, as we all have experienced now, come bright spots. So these bright spots would be where things are happening, where innovation is happening, who is responding to these difficult times, right? So these stories are not inherently good or bad. It's more about whether they are a useful set of stories to think strategically about what we might need to do. What are some of the opportunities or challenges that may emerge? Or what decisions I need to start making today so they can influence what might happen in the years ahead. So in that regard, we have these 4 stories, and they go into different directions. But my invitation today is that if you think about the future, think about what you want for the future. And then what are the things that could move you in that direction? Those strategies that you could start today or tomorrow or next week, but that you ultimately want them to align to what you want for the future. And this would apply to different layers of your life. It could be what you want for yourself, for your family, for your community, for you at work, for you personally. Yeah, everyone has a future. So you can apply these to different levels of yourself. And now when you think about it, there were different mentions of technology in this forecast. So these 4 stories had things that were technology related that were part of these stories. So we talked about AR, we talked about VR, we talked about artificial intelligence, we talked about hybrid town halls, for example, or we talked about having credentials in digital ledgers or blockchain technology. So there are different ways in which technology could support these stories. And even in the stories, you can see that it might be the same technology in different scenarios because it could be used in different ways. So we created, or for this presentation, actually, I went ahead and just went back, read all the stories, pulled all the technologies that we had mentioned, and had them in a beautiful slide for you. And then I used also a model called the 3 Horizon to show you kind of how I understood them But that was not really the point. So I'm gonna just take you to the point. The point was that in doing that exercise, just for this presentation, I had a couple of insights that I wanted to share with you. So one was that in those technologies that we mentioned, there were two types of technologies. So ones that were directly operating within education and those that were outside of education, but would have a huge impact in how things operated within education. So for example, we talked about labor automation. And that you can see that could have an impact in education, but it might not be that you are automating a professor. You know, it's just the way that we train and educate people to work with or alongside automated systems and hardware would be very different. So we would need to start changing how we do things. And even the way we operate right within education as an institution. So there was that type of technology. So, and that's something that we call inbound and outbound change. So things that could be changing within education could be, for example, and I saw it in one of the things that's in your folder there in front of you, it's adaptive learning. And how that's not quite, at least in the US, widespread, but it's something that it's bringing in the future, right? Wouldn't it be like so cool that as you are learning, things would change to adapt to how you are learning? Wow, that would be amazing, right? The Jetsons. Well, it is true, right? But it's also gonna change so much outside of education. So that is kind of one of my invitations here. It's like having that realization of how inbound and outbound change in the, as technology innovates, changes how we teach and learn. Then the other insight that I had from doing this exercise was that there are almost two different futures for technology in terms of what we see. And this took me like a little bit to grapple with. So one was just the technological advancement and how technology actually evolves. So things that might sound like a little outlandish today, but they will come to fruition, or not, I'm not to say will, but they might come to fruition, right? So I was mentioning digital ledgers for credentials. So we don't have them quite widespread right now, but they might, like we can see a future in which that would happen. And that is an advancement of the technology itself. But we also see something like universal high-speed broadband internet. And the internet has been around now for a few decades. We're pretty familiar with it, right? But what is then different about this idea of universal high-speed broadband internet? It's the values that are supporting this technology, right? What needs to change? The assumptions, kind of, if you think about it, what's the public opinion that needs to support this idea that the internet should be a public good? And that would be a change in the technology itself and how we use it. And another similar example is that we talked about non-commercial social media. We all are pretty familiar with social media. It's good things and bad things. So, but the idea that it could be non-commercial, it's a little bit different, and it would be sustained by different social values. It would speak to a different, it's not about the attention economy and trying to sell ads, because it wouldn't be like whole, maybe privately, it would be something that a government would support or a university might support, just as a way to provide another way of communication and interaction for their own people, their own community, right? So that's what makes it a little bit different. And I hope you're following along with these ideas. I know that I could either speak too fast or kind of ramble a little. So with these two things, then we had the realization, and one of our insights after the process for the last forecast was that technology can be channel for liberation, for education liberation. And that was a wonderful insight, right? It was like, yes, we can do this. We can have technology that can support values of self-determination and agency and people's rights to shape their own future and culturally responsive learning experiences. But keep in mind that as we can do that, we can also do the total opposite. We can be perpetuating oppressive systems and structures for our learners and educators. And that's where the catch is. Because we need to be very mindful and very intentional with the decisions that we're making today for our learning communities. So I had 5 key takeaways that you should take with you just to think about. So first, the future needs to start sometime. And you're already here today. So what about now, right? Why don't we start thinking about this today? Maybe yesterday was a great time too, but we have today. And you're already here, which is a great first step. So just kind of like keep the momentum going, right? And that way we can start sooner rather than later. The second insight there, or takeaway that I want you to consider is begin with a future in mind. So if you have questions, that's okay. That's totally normal. I have questions all the time. And that's good. We need to be comfortable with asking those questions, especially if they're ahead of time and not after the fact. Not as a reactionary running around the room, just like, oh, what's going on? I don't understand. No, let's try to begin with the future in mind. So let's try to think about those possibilities for the future and prepare for them by design and not just put some band-aids along the way, because you ultimately end up probably not supporting those values that you want to happen, that you want for the future, because there are so many things, there are so many kind of fires that you need to put down, really. And it's, again, understandable. So it would be great if we can just start kind of early and often to think about these things. Now, another takeaway is to consider short and long-term possibilities, because sometimes an idea looks great in the short term, but not so good when you start going down the knock-on effects, right? So you think about ice cream and you're like, yeah, ice cream. But then you're like, wait a minute. What is ice cream gonna do to my body later? Maybe not so good, right? That doesn't mean that you can have ice cream sometimes. That's fine. No, I'm not going to judge you. I'm actually going to have ice cream with you. But we need to think about what's coming next so we can prepare for it. So if you're going to have ice cream, then maybe go to the gym that day. Go for a run also. You know, just to kind of counterbalance things. Okay. So recap of the first 3. Future needs to start somewhere, begin with a future in mind, and short and long-term consequences, right? And then we have the last 2. One is about keeping an eye at least, or just, you know, what's happening outside of education. I know it's hard. There's so many things going on within education that you can keep up with, right? But just like spend some time every now and then considering that what's happening in technology outside of education might already be giving you enough hints of what might be coming to education in the next few years, just because it might eventually make the transition to education. And we've seen that hundreds of times. So, and even you can do that exercise yourself. As you see like a new technology popping up somewhere, you can be like, wait a minute, how can that be translated into what I do, into what we do? And that can already give you an edge into your work. So just try to incorporate a way that you and your team, your learning community, think about inbound and outbound change in education. So at least keep an eye on how things might be changing outside of education. And then lastly, the last takeaway here is, again, technology is really a vessel in which we pour our values in. So what are those values that we are supporting with the technologies or the decisions that we're making for our learning communities when we decide to implement certain platform, or if we don't decide to do this thing. So it's, again, I know it might sound a little bit abstract, but it's just as when artificial intelligence, it's like learning from what they're seeing or the data that you're feeding it. It's exactly the same. When someone is designing some technology solution, even when we don't understand it or we don't really see it, they are putting assumptions into the system. So what are those assumptions? Let's question them. Let's explore them. Let's spend some time with them and learn from that. So my last point, I promise, is that as you spend these 2 days together here looking into the future of learning, and you're gonna hear about the future a lot, right? Just like I experienced back in 2020 and I still do. Ask yourself, whose future are they presenting to me? Why do I need to learn about this future? Who benefits from having me learn about this future? Whose future are they talking about? Because it's so easy to throw that word around. But it's on us to fight the hype with critical thinking. And it's not easy. So just take that question with you. Whose future? And that might help you. That's all. Thank you, everyone.
Maria, it is evident that despite being a futures and foresight researcher, you are quite comfortable with expecting the unexpected. You orated an exceptional keynote, sans slide deck on the futures for liberating teaching and learners and technology, rather. It's my pleasure to open it up to 15 minutes of Q&A. Are there anyone want to get us started here?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. That was a really great talk. And this is a really big question. So I apologize for that, but I'm guessing that your team took it into consideration. What types of things might we do? Understanding we can think about small wins in our own context. What can we do with a significantly entrenched system of capitalism that we're fighting against when we talk about liberated education?
Yeah, big question. And we certainly ran into that with our contributors. It was kind of like a mic drop, moment there that we had with them. I cannot, speak to like the mighty right answer or the key to this huge question. One thing that our team has started to reflect about, and especially in our position as a nonprofit foundation with an endowment that comes from student debt loan. So wonderful, right? Is that we have started to work with this idea of enoughness, and that being a social value. When is it enough? And how can we bring others along in that journey of enoughness? And that applies to so many areas of our work as well. So for example, in the United States, we are working with different states to do what we call a state transformation. So we're working with school districts and Department of Educations to work like developing the capacity of the people in the ground, like working directly with students. But we are also working with policymakers to support, like have the policy to support the innovation that's happening. And we go back to that enoughness point, because when should we start saying no to work? It's just like, we don't need to do everything and anything just because we can or because people approach us. There are other organizations that are doing a fantastic job as well. And why do we need to feel like we need to hoard all this? And that is kind of like one of the bases of capitalism, right? Just like constant accumulation. So I think even that entry point of thinking of enoughness and that idea of like, when is it enough, could be a good way to start the conversation in a way that won't scare as many people, because it's a big change. And there are also like so many models. There's in terms of what comes next, there's so many questions that there's also the big uncertainty of answering that question, that then people feel even more reluctant to go there because we don't know what might come next. So how can we even envision that future? But there are some good books out there that you can start like reading and considering. I personally know that the current program coordinator of the Strategic Foresight program at the University of Houston, where I come from, he is working on a book called After Capitalism. And he has been in the last few years just gathering various research inputs, weak signals that we call early indicators, to kind of try to put together at least a list of what different economic models might replace capitalism as we understand it. So we'll see. I mean, it is a possibility, but there's also the chance that we keep just kind of tweaking it a little bit more instead of like making just like a complete overhaul of the whole thing. Yeah, good question. I hope I answered it.
You mentioned the implosion of capitalism. So now I have like a whole other question, but I'm going to stick to the first one. Your 4 quadrants that you had, I could totally see them in my head. You did a great job. And I just was curious, in terms of the low, high, and high, low, social cohesion or responsiveness of our public institutions was one of those more impactful in terms of supporting a future that was liberatory, with liberatory education? Like social cohesion or responsiveness institution, did one present as particularly more powerful than the other?
Yes. So one of the things that we, again, realized in working with the contributors, and it was another mic drop moment, it was fantastic. It was just like, the power relies on the people. So and it's also one of the insights from the whole research process, just as technology can be channeled for liberation, it was just that you absolutely need to have social cohesion to have liberatory education futures. And the responsiveness of public educations, it's good, it helps. And it certainly helps making it more of a systemic approach, but it's not fundamental as social cohesion is. Is that kind of what you had assumed? Yeah. Yeah, and there is more detail about that in the forecast. So you can absolutely read about it if you're still curious or want to learn a little bit more. Yeah.
We have a virtual community joining us. I'm just checking our Zoom airways as well. Mm-hmm. I invite any other questions. We've still got a couple minutes. Maybe I'll pop one in here. So within the matrix, the 2x2, yeah, what could be other factors, external factors, yeah, that might bleed into that matrix?
Yes, great question, because it was also part of the process. So we started with a list of, I think it was something from 24 to 18 drivers of change. So forces that would have an impact in this future. And that's how we, that was kind of the starting point to get to the 2 critical uncertainties. But in the other 20 or so that didn't make it to become a critical uncertainty, they are still present in the forecast. And they are aspects of the stories that we still consider. So technology was one of them. It's so fundamental. We all live and breathe technology. It is such an intrinsic, important part of our behaviors today, like having your phone with you all the time, not using a watch because you have the time on your phone, things like that, little, but that are changing our behaviors. We also have entrenched poverty, for example, was one of them. One of the timeless needs that, again, we couldn't overlook. So it was one of the big drivers. We also have a societal kind of reckoning that we were all experiencing around that time. So it was important for us to include it as well. There was another one about just the health of our societies, because we were seeing so many things about not only COVID, but even just what's called despair diseases. So how many people were or are still, unfortunately, dying from opioids, for example, or how lifestyle decisions are impacting our life expectancy, especially in the Western Hemisphere. So those are just a few that I can remember right now, but there are certainly others that we included. We start with a secondary research process of trends that explore technology, economic, political, environmental, and social changes or trends.
Thank you. Maria, as Terry makes his way over to the expensive ramp, I'm going to offer the first of 2 thank yous. Please join me in thanking Maria today for her insightful and energizing keynote.